Welcome to TimesPro's 98th Leadership News lecture on a very interesting topic, Chief Strategy Officer, the road less traveled. And to do this, we have a very illustrious gentleman, Mr. Subramanian Chidambaram. And let me have the pleasure of introducing him before I hand over the platform to him. Subramanian leads the strategy function for Cummins India since March 2021. And in this role, he is responsible for identifying and driving strategic opportunities that help achieve the vision for Cummins India. He leads the company's future roadmap with a focus on Cummins Destination Zero strategy for zero carbon emissions. He also spearheads the electrolyzer strategy and supports the new power strategy, including batteries and energy storage solutions. Prior to joining Cummins, Subramanian led strategy and digitalization for distribution business of Siemens Limited for nearly 5 years and took care of global strategic projects, cost reduction programs, portfolio digitalization, process excellence, and more. And before that, he worked at McKinsey and Siemens Management Consulting for over 6 years, where he spearheaded transformation programs and developed business and corporate strategies for players across sectors, including logistics, cement, oil and gas, conglomerates, and engineering, and across functions, primarily in strategy, operations, and sales and marketing. He was also part of the team that developed the McKinsey report on India from poverty to empowerment. And prior to joining or working with McKinsey during his tenure at Siemens, Subramanian had been instrumental in implementing the order tracking system tool for sales order management for one of their factories in Mumbai, and was part of lean manufacturing transformation project, first of its kind in Siemens factories outside Germany. And Subramanian also holds I would say he holds a postgraduate diploma in management from IIM Lucknow in operations and strategy specialization, and a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from VTIT Mumbai. He has several national, international papers to his credit, along with articles on operations strategy. Very, very rare for a corporate veteran. And more than anything else, he has got other various interests, also very, very interesting, I would say. Beyond work, Subramanian has been pursuing study of Sanskrit language since 2012, and Carnatic music since the age of 13 as his two key passions. He completed his master's in Sanskrit, MA Sanskrit specialized in Vedanta in 2017, and is currently pursuing his PhD in very interesting topic, Indic leadership from Chinmaya Vishwa Vidyapeeth. And as a passionate Indic scholar, he has authored several articles on various subjects related to Sanatan Dharma, and has also been recognized for his work in various forums. Subramanian also gives performance combining Indian music, Sanskrit, Indic philosophy, and Indic tradition, etc., making it a delight for the listeners. And we have him today for this wonderful session. And I'm sure all of us and each one of us will have some quite a few actionable insights, because it looks very titular head, head kind of thing, the position. But then somebody who has been through this, not just as a company, but also in the consulting point of view from McKinsey, I think you will have great insights. Over to you, Subramanian.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Nagendra, and thanks for this wonderful opportunity for me to be able to share my experiences and my thoughts with all of you. Over the next 30 to 35 minutes, what I'll do is I'll just share the insights and experiences I've had over this tenure, which Dr. Nagendra did mention as a part of the introduction. So this is purely coming out of that to say how I went through it and what I think about it. Would be more than happy to then open the floor for questions and any comments that all of you have. I have a short presentation which I'll use as an anchor for my presentation and for sharing my thoughts. I hope all of you can see the presentation.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So when we look at an organization, right, let's start from the beginning. We have these three terms that we define for an organization or for any institution. We speak about a mission, we speak about the vision, and we speak about the strategy. Now, what do these actually mean in very simple terms? The mission is basically talking about why we as an organization or an institution are existing. What is the purpose of our existence? Once the purpose is clear, the vision speaks about what is it that you want to achieve. in achieving that purpose in the long term. What is it that you want to achieve for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years, in the medium terms? What is it that you want to achieve? That speaks about the vision. The strategy then speaks about how do you achieve it. The how part of it is not as easy. You would think that once the mission and the vision is clear, the how part should be clear. Fine, you know where to go. But how do you go there? It's not that easy because there are multiple paths that could lead to that. And you really don't know which path is going to lead to that position in how much of time, with how much of efforts, and how much of resources. So that's where the importance or the placement of strategy comes in the entire scheme of things. It's basically a set of trade-offs, a set of choices that you need to make to say, how do I reach that vision? What is the path I adopt? And how do I adopt that path? That's essentially what strategy speaks about. So strategy has been existing for a long period of time. I'm not going to go into the history of strategy and the rest. But of late, probably over the last few years, the strategy as a function has become more critical. Why is that so? That's because a lot of things in the environment are undergoing change. You have the emergence of digitalization in a huge way happening across the board. Digitalization not just for a B2C industry, but also for a B2B industry. Not just at the customer end, but right from the time of sourcing a material, manufacturing the material, designing the material, taking the material to your distributors and dealers, and then taking it out to the customer. At every process, digitalization has started to make its presence felt because of the kind of productivity, the kind of efficiency, the kind of transparency that it starts to offer. That is changing the dynamics of the market. You have different kinds of players emerging because digitization or digitalization is becoming a key trend. The green, the climate change, decarbonization, the net zero, all of this are becoming common buzzwords today, where everyone is thinking hugely about ESG, thinking about green initiatives. How do we ensure that we don't pollute or we don't destroy the planet more and bring it back to a stage where our further generations can live happily? That is changing the way we are doing businesses. That is changing the way our products are. For example, when you look at the green scenario, you would have a hugely lower dependence on your fossil fuels and traditional fuels. Imagine for a country like India, where still 70 to 80% of your electricity is still coming from coal-powered power plants. To shift that to renewable sources of energy like the wind and the solar and the tidal and the hydro, you can imagine the kind of shift that is happening. This further leading to aspects such as batteries, aspects such as hydrogen. All of this is started to emerge. In mobility, you can see that a lot of the two-wheelers and three-wheelers that we are seeing around us are already moving into electric vehicles. It's taking huge shape in the passenger car segments, and it is also moving towards the higher power segments like the medium and the heavy commercial vehicles. So that is playing a key role in changing the way we are thinking about business. Sustainability, circular economy, it's becoming again a key aspect as you're linking the whole thing towards decarbonization, towards a sustainable future. To say that what the entire disposal mechanism of whatever we are using, how is that polluting the environment, and how can that be put back to use so that we are not releasing something into an environment which is going to harm us back. That is it's already picked up as a great trend, and it's going to become a major trend in years to come. That is changing the way companies are operating, organizations are operating. We are already having the regulators such as SEBI mandating or requiring your ESG reports to say that how are you placed on your ESG in your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and so many other mechanics and details to that. The entire aspect of startups, idea generation. Even 10 years before, you didn't have such a huge startup ecosystem that existed. Today, a huge amount of startups coming up in all the newer areas that probably even the established organizations do not have enough expertise or enough headway. It is being led. Many of these areas or topics are being led by the startups and the newer companies, the SMEs and the MSMEs. The ecosystem is very favorable for them, and they are coming up with extremely great ideas. And these ideas are changing the way businesses are thinking or businesses are functioning. In the center is the aspect of globalization versus regionalization. The entire aspect of saying, how do I leverage the capabilities across the globe, while at the same time creating enough opportunities for people in my region? How do I leverage the low-cost economies, the economies that have the leverage of low-cost labor, low-cost resources, at the same time creating opportunities for my own people? That kind of balance is beginning to emerge. And a huge aspect of thinking about how do I, if I'm going to start a new factory, where do I start that new factory? Which place do I need to start that? What kind of incentives mechanisms are available today? What kind of advantages do I have if I start a factory in X versus Y versus Z? These all have become considerations for the organizations as they are progressing or as they are advancing on their growth path. These are some of the trends that I've mentioned here, but there are many, many more trends that are really shaping or they're really defining the way businesses need to operate today and in the coming years. So all these in a way are disruptions. They are all positive disruptions, but they are disruptions. These disruptions need a different way to think. Because if we were doing the business the way we were doing the last 50 years is how we are going to continue doing business the next 50 years, you don't need strategy. You can just continue doing your business and you'll be successful. The very fact that you need strategy is because things are changing and you need to start rethinking on the path that you need to take to still achieve your vision. Given this background, now let me come to the specific role of the chief strategic officer or the chief strategy officer or the strategy leader, variedly called in different contexts. Now, typically when you look at an organization, you have the leader, who's at the apex of the organization, the CEO or the MD of the organization, and you have a host of leaders, commonly referred to as the top management team, which would include the financial officer, the business leaders, the chief marketing officer, the HR leader, the chief information officer, supply chain officer, the technology officer, and host of other leaders. When we say that things are changing around us, things are changing in the market, and you need to decide how this is affecting your organization, things are changing in every space. Things are changing for the business. So things are changing for the business leader. Things are changing in a talent perspective. So things are changing for the CHRO. Things are changing from a digital space. So things are changing from a chief information officer. Things are changing in terms of technology. Hence, things are changing for a CTO. Things are changing for manufacturing and supply chain and sourcing. Hence, things are changing for a chief supply chain officer. So each one of them is doing strategy because each one of them needs to think, how am I recruiting today versus how will I recruit 10 years down the line? How am I sourcing the materials today versus how do I need to source materials 10 years down the line? How am I designing my product today versus how do I design my product 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line? So each them is trying to choose a path, make a choice, make trade-offs, make those balances and trying to achieve their vision. So in a way, strategy is being done by each one of them. So each of these boxes and many more boxes that are there in the organization are in a way doing strategy for their function or their perspective. Then the question is, what is the role of a chief strategic officer then? The way I think about the chief strategic officer is that the chief strategy officer acts as the hub for all these other leaders that are there in the top management team of the organization. There is no doubt that each person, each of these leaders is trying to define the strategy for their own function to say how things will move, what are the choices they need to make, what are the trade-offs they need to make, and probably they are best placed to make those trade-offs and choices. But the chief strategic officer acts as the fulcrum for the organization and sees what is the overview picture, what is the bird's eye view picture. So if the CIO decides to make a choice and the CHRO decides to make another choice, are these both compatible? Together, do they make sense to the organization or not? So essentially, I would say, if I look at it as a puzzle, each person is trying to define his or her own set of the puzzle, but the chief strategic officer, along with the chief executive officer, along with the CEO, needs to be able to have that overarching view to say that is all of this fitting into a puzzle which is suitable for the organization. So what part of the puzzle is not fitting in? Is it fitting in? What is the gap? What part of the puzzle is still not solved? And we need to bring it up onto the table to solve for. That is essentially how the role of a chief strategic officer is emerging in various organizations. Now, let me put certain thoughts and certain myths or certain preconceived notions that we have about the chief strategic officer. And let me clarify how I think about this. There is a common perception that the chief strategic officer is the one, because he is the chief strategy officer, right? He's the strategy leader. Hence, he or she must be deciding the strategy. He should be deciding the strategy for the organization. Whereas the chief strategic officer facilitates the strategy formulation. We just saw right now that one person, how is it even feasible for us to think that one person is going to decide the entire strategy for the organization? Because the organization has got so many elements attached to it. It has got a talent perspective, a digitalization, an IT perspective, a business perspective, a technology. How is one person even expected to know all these things? So moving from a chief strategic officer deciding the strategy for the organization, it is better to say that the chief strategic officer facilitates the strategy formulation, facilitates the definition of the strategy by coordinating and by bringing the required stakeholders together. The natural follow-up of that, many people think, is that because the person is deciding strategy, so even while recruiting the strategic officer, it's about the fact that the chief strategic officer should know everything about everything. So it's about knowledge quotient, right? The person knows about everything, so he can be a chief strategic officer. That again is far from the ideal. That is a utopian world that we would be living in if we were to say that it could only be probably the CEO who has to double up as the chief strategic officer many of the times then. So the chief strategic officer doesn't need to know everything about everything, but needs to ensure that the right information is brought together on the table for the discussion to happen for us to solve the problem. As I said earlier about the puzzle, the chief strategic officer duty is to look at the puzzle and see, is the puzzle fitting in? Is there a conflict happening between one part of the puzzle versus the other part? And what is the challenge? What is the gap? And how does this get resolved? That necessarily becomes, or essentially becomes, the role of the chief strategic officer. There's also a very popular misconception or a belief that the chief strategic officer is all about expertise in a specific industry. So if some person has spent a number of years in the industry and he knows the head and tail of the industry, yes, we can recruit him as a chief strategic officer because he knows everything about this industry. He will be able to give us solutions. That is not the role of the chief strategic officer. If the person has spent those many years in the organization in a particular business and knows end to end about that business, the person should be coming in as a business leader and running that business because he knows what that business is all about. Chief strategic officer is not about expertise about a specific industry. The chief strategic officer, it is about a skill set. It is about a capability. It doesn't depend upon the industry. So I'll come later to what I exactly mean when I come to the defining the roles and responsibilities of the chief strategic officer. The duty of the chief strategic officer is not necessarily to say that I know everything about this industry, hence I can be the chief strategic officer of this organization. On the contrary, it is about a thought process that the chief strategic officer brings on the table. It is about the structuring. It is about the questioning. It's about synthesizing information. It's about trying to figure out, okay, 10 people have spoken to me about this information. What do I make out of this? And what is really emerging? So this kind of training typically happens in a management consulting background, where literally you get into a particular problem which you have no clue about. You start studying the problem, you get into the details of the problem, and by the end of it, you try to arrive at a solution to that problem. How do you do that? You have no experience in that industry or that function or that business. But the way you try to get into it is to go by the first principles, to say that, okay, this is a problem. And my duty is to find a solution to the problem. The problem could be anything, but the solution will have a process. And that is what the chief strategic officer brings to the table. The other common comment that we get to hear a lot, chief strategic officer means he must be making great presentations. Yes, I don't disagree, right? Yes, we do need to make great presentations. But the importance is, what is the presentation for? When you're making a presentation, the question is, what are you trying to drive? What message are you trying to drive through the presentation? So driving the thought process through the presentation. Yes, it is an attractive presentation, but what makes it really effective is the fact that the presentation is able to drive the thought process in the room, on the table, and the presentation is made for that. That is the skill set that the chief strategic officer needs to bring onto the table. So these are some of the common misconceptions which I thought I should put my view in to say that how I think about the role of the chief strategic officer. Now, very specifically on the strategy formulation itself, I would like to say that the way I look at strategy itself or strategy formulation, it happens in 4 steps. The first part is about creating the strategy. It's about developing the strategy formulation part. That's just one part of the story. The second part is about communicating the strategy very effectively. You're making the strategy for whom? For a larger organization. So making the strategy and putting up in your shelf or putting up with those 10 to 12 people is not enough. It needs to get communicated to the people who are actually going to get affected or going to get influenced by that strategy or going to get impacted by that strategy. Third thing is resourcing the strategy, which I'll come to. And the fourth thing is measuring the strategy. So these are also aspects that go into the roles and the responsibilities of the chief strategic officer to say that how does he or she play a role in each of those 4 elements. In creating the strategy, the facts, I have put certain bullet points here. I'm not going to read out all of them out here, but just going to focus on a few of them. To say that creating of a strategy is about looking at a longer lens, looking at a longer period of time, having a foresight into things, not talking about a medium short-term plan. That doesn't become a strategy. So when you're talking about a longer-term vision, a longer-term plan, over the next 5 years, over the next 6 years, you may not have enough data to really say what's going to happen in the next 5 years. So not too much of reliance on data makes sense here. So data analytics is useful, but not enough for you to really define what the strategy will look like or what the organization should do. The whole game is about being in the moment, keeping your eyes and ears open to say what's happening in the market, talking to business leaders, talking to various people in the industry, talking to the veterans of the industry, discussing with them as to what they think is going to happen to the industry. How are things in the industry going to change? What are the major trends that are going to come up in the industry? These business insights and business acumen is what will really feed in to defining the strategy for the organization. And this is exactly what the chief strategy officer also needs to encourage and facilitate more so that the strategy that is getting developed is more in line with what would be useful to the organization. And it is a team effort. It is, as I said earlier, it is not about the strategic officer creating the strategy. It's about him or her pulling things together from all the relevant sources and giving shape to the whole thing. And of course, following up that strategy with a proper roadmap to say how the strategy is going to get implemented. The second aspect where the chief strategic officer needs to focus on is about helping the chief executive officer or the leaders of the organization really communicate the strategy to the organization. Because communication is very clear. I could be creating a strategy which is fantastic, which is of n number of slides and beautifully done and with all the jargons in the world, great. But if my employees don't understand even a word of it, my strategy has failed. Because for the people for whom the strategy is being made, they need to understand it simply and clearly to say, what is it that you want to say? Where are you taking this organization and what is it that you want to communicate to them? So communicating the strategy in simple terms is also the role of the chief strategic officer that he needs to facilitate and keep iterating, keep re-emphasizing on the same thing again and again. Resourcing the strategy. The chief strategic officer needs to ensure that along with the other leaders, the strategy that is created doesn't remain just in the bookshelf or it doesn't just remain in PPTs, but gets onto the ground. And for that, you need people to drive it. So immediately the moment a strategy gets made, you need to associate a person with that strategy. Say, who is going to drive the strategy? The person behind the face, behind the strategy should be made clear. The team should be clear. The chief strategic officer must ensure that the top management attention is given to these initiatives and all the required support is provided to these teams for them to take it ahead. And measuring, the most important thing. Anything that doesn't get measured is not going to get successful. So it's important to say that if I'm creating a strategy, I'm creating an initiative, how am I going to measure that? And that also becomes a responsibility of the chief strategic officer and his team to ensure how this tracking and monitoring mechanism of all the initiatives that they have defined as a part of the strategy is getting tracked or is progressing or is advancing. Now coming to the roles and responsibilities of the chief strategic officer, based on all that I discussed till now. The first contribution or the role of the chief strategic officer is to bring structure in the discussions and the thought process. There could be 15 people sitting across the table with a different thought process, all of them valid. But how are we going to arrive at a common thought process for us to move ahead? How are we going to draw everyone together? How are we going to structure this for the problem at hand? That is the role of the chief strategic officer. Synthesizing and summarizing the discussions to say, okay, so this is what we understand. This is what we are trying to say. From here, how do we proceed? Asking the right questions and challenging. As I said earlier, it is not essential for the chief strategic officer to know everything about everything in the organization. He or she will learn it. Of course, they do need to learn things of the organization because they are creating the strategy of it. So they need to know what the organization is all about, what the products of the organization are all about. But that will not come in day one. That's going to come as they pick up the role, as they start working on those aspects. So the key thing that they need to start off with is asking the right questions, challenging the status quo to say that why are we doing what we are doing? Isn't this wrong? Isn't this not possible? Isn't this possible? Asking all those questions and bringing conflict into the room or onto the table is very critical. Getting the stakeholders together. The chief strategic officer must be one of the individuals or one of the people or one of the key people in the top management team who acts as the conduit for all the stakeholders. Because you have a top management team, you could be having various dynamics that go on within this top management team. But it's very important that all stakeholders come together to discuss topics and to align, agree on various areas for the organization to move ahead. Hence, it's important that there are conduits. There are people who can bring people together on the table and get them moving in the common direction. The chief strategic officer should be one of those conduits who should be able to drive this kind of an alignment in the top management team. Acting as the trusted advisor for the chief executive officer and the top management team, very important. Because the chief strategic officer is the one that has to draw from everyone. Because people have their wisdom in their respective areas of functions and business. But the whole question is, how does that fit into the whole picture? So the chief strategic officer needs to act as the one who tries to capture these. And for that, it's not important that the chief strategic officer just has a transactional relationship with these colleagues and peers, but needs to act as their trusted advisor, needs to be able to advise them, give them suggestions on what could be done better, how they could do things differently for their own function, for their own business. So the chief strategic officer is just not the strategy of the company, but also strategy for every business, strategy for every function. So acting as a trusted advisor for the respective leaders. The chief strategic officer is the one that holds the strategic process together. There is a strategic process that needs to run, that runs in every organization. A strategic planning process, a strategic formulation process every year or every 2 years, etc. How does that process run? Running that process with rigor, perfectly tracking and monitoring with discipline, and ensuring that everything moves and goes in a common path becomes the role or the responsibility of the chief strategic officer. Being comfortable not being in the limelight, because, and this has been a common experience I've had in the past, even my teams coming up to me and saying that, when someone else does a project, say it could be a business project, a sales project, a supply chain or technology, it's out there, it's visible that, okay, this people did it or this person did it. And the recognition comes in. But we as strategy team, we do not get the recognition. Yes, because as strategy, you are always behind the scene. You're always acting with the teams, with the functions, with the business. You are helping them, you're maneuvering, helping them maneuver. You're facilitating. You're playing these roles. And naturally, the definition of these roles becomes that you would not be the person who has achieved it, but you are one of the people who have helped them achieve it. So the limelight may not come easily to the strategic officer or to the team of the strategic officer, and that they need to be comfortable with. Yes, you need to find ways and means of still rewarding them, recognizing them, all of those being there. I'm saying in general, the quantum would be much lesser in terms of their visibility. They would be working on confidential projects, which you can't even say anything outside. So that then becomes a bit of a challenging thing. And that is something that the team needs to be comfortable with, which they could compensate by the next point to say, how do they facilitate execution? So as far as they're in the strategic phase or the planning phase, things will be undercover. Things will be confidential. Things will not come into the limelight. But the moment it starts getting into execution, then things start coming into the limelight. They start being known to people. So getting involved in the execution of the strategy is very important. What we need to understand is there's always a misconception where many of the times the expectation is that the strategy member should execute the strategy. No. If the strategy member is going to execute the strategy, then what is the difference between the strategy person and the actual business person on the ground? Their role becomes exactly the same. The role of a strategy person is to define the strategy, means define the thought process, which can help in execution. So the person should be involved in the execution of the strategy to ensure that the execution is smooth, is seamless. So those tweaks, those changes in the strategy need to be made so as to help the execution, because that feeds in back to the strategy. The pilots or the demos, the feedback signals from there feed in back to the strategy and help in refining the strategy, and that is a must. But it doesn't mean that you become the executor of the project, because that is a different role, which of course the strategy team member or the strategy officer does get into as a part of the growth within the organization. So these are some of the thought processes I have on what are the roles and responsibilities of the chief strategic officer. Now, coming to when you look at the role of the chief strategic officer in organizations, increasingly, probably in a couple of decades before, you had those chief strategic officer or strategy leader roles which were independent. But very soon, and various reports such as the McKinsey report, etc., have even validated this to say that of late, if you see, most of the roles of chief strategic officer are not just chief strategic officer roles, they are an and role. That means you would be a chief strategic officer and the chief of staff, chief strategic officer and sustainability or ESG leader, and crop communications and digitalization and transformation and special projects and so on. So there are various reasons why this could have emerged. In some of these cases, it makes sense to club these together. For example, if a company is focused on sustainability, say it's an energy company, so energy transitions and all of this is a key aspect of that company. So sustainability also becomes a key aspect of strategy. So the chief strategic officer managing sustainability as well as the strategy for the organization makes sense. Chief of staff, because you are the person who is dealing with the entire top management team or the top leadership team and trying to pull them together, The chief of staff literally helps discipline or structure the entire thought process or the entire proceedings of the top management team, which again makes sense. So there are a few of these which become natural combinations, but some of these are also done to help the chief strategic officer then move into a line role or into a business role, so that they, having executed certain projects, they having executed certain big transformation projects, then could move into a business role, which could be leading that particular business, which could be leading that particular project in a bigger scale, etc. So this is how it's been evolving now. It's all been an and role that you see happening nowadays. Now I'm going to conclude with the growth path of the chief strategic officer. So the very common growth path that you would see in most of the examples that you see around would be the chief strategic officer then moving into a business leader role, taking on the role of a business leader, or moving directly into the chief executive officer. So just becoming the CEO, they would place the candidate as a chief strategic officer for some amount of time, and then move the candidate into the chief executive officer, because creating the strategy happens there, and then as a chief executive officer, you really execute that strategy for the organization. So and so on. So the chief strategic officer acts as a stepping stone for many of these line roles or leadership positions. This is what you see most common. But personally, I have a very different thought process on this. As I was saying earlier, the chief strategic officer or strategy leader, it is about a skill set. It is about a capability. This skill set or capability can only become better and better when you keep doing that job again and again. You become very good at that job. Just like you would take a chief information officer or chief supply chain officer, they over a period of time, they become experts in those fields. They become experts of supply chain, they become experts of information technology or experts of digitalization. They then become experts, so they become natural choices for them to lead those functions going ahead. Similarly, I also feel that the chief strategic officer is also a skill set and a capability. It's not just about anyone and anyone could become a chief strategic officer by the side and then move into another role. I do not see it that way. I see it that if you have to really explore the role of a chief strategic officer and get the fullest benefit of it, it speaks about certain skill sets and capabilities that have to get developed over a period of time by remaining in those similar kind of roles again and again. So I always look at the chief strategic officer role as a role that needs to move into larger strategic projects, into larger strategic roles, maybe a bigger region, maybe a larger business, but still remaining in the vicinity of strategy. Still remaining in the vicinity of strategy formulation, strategy execution, and not necessarily speaking about a line role. So there are different viewpoints to this. There are people who say that if you don't really get into a line role, how do you really know how your strategy is getting executed? That's a fair point. Yes, you could do such roles for a short period of time to really know how does your strategy really get executed and what are the challenges you face as a business leader when you have to execute a strategy. But I still believe that a chief strategic officer is a skill set and a capability that needs to be honed year after year, job after job, a responsibility after responsibility, so that that becomes an expertise in itself, which then can become natural choices for leading strategies or defining strategies for the organizations. That's where I'll stop. I think I've already taken a lot of time, so I'll pause here and then open up for questions.
Thank you, Subramanian. I think it's quite a lot. I think it's a very interesting way of putting it together. And we have quite a few questions. And with your permission, can I begin?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So we have two questions from Mr. Nilesh. And his first question is, would you prefer LLMS, right, large language models, or specialized models hosted in your enterprise domain? And the second question is, how is Cummins landscape changing due to AI?
Okay. On the LLMs or specialized models in the enterprise domain, I am not sure whether I would be the right person to address this question. I don't think I am the expert domain, the domain expert to really speak about that. But coming to the point of AI, now not just Cummins, when I take the manufacturing landscape, companies like Cummins who are involved in manufacturing, they are manufacturing industries by themselves. I think AI, manufacturing and service, AI is playing a huge role. What is AI playing a role in? AI is playing a huge role in manufacturing scenario itself. Manufacturing, right from the time you are sourcing the material, quality, right? Incoming quality, testing of quality, quality across the line, uh, assembling or putting together various materials on the shop floor through AI so that you are uh, delivering the product first time right without any defects. The zero defect quality or zero defect strategy is being hugely aided by AI. Once the entire thing is out of your factory, the entire distribution network, getting onto your distributors, getting onto your dealers, getting onto your customers is hugely driven by AI. Now, as far as customer behaviors are concerned, maybe a company like Cummins or similar companies may not be that affected because we are still B2B in a large way. So it's not a B2C business where the end customer preference by person would matter. But still, if you consider the kind of products that we sell into trucks, the you know the buying behaviors of fleet owners and the truck drivers and all of this become very important. How they're driving their trucks, what kind of issues they're facing. So in all these areas, I think AI is playing a huge role.
Thank you, Subramanian. And this is from Mr. Abhishek. More than a question, I think he wants a clarification. Please define the term industry agnostic. He's referring to one of the things that you were talking
Yes.
about in one of the
So what I
slides.
meant by industry agnostic, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So what I meant by industry agnostic was, see, when you say chief strategic officer, the person has been leading, say, he's been the chief strategic officer for steel industries for a long period of time. Hence, he or she becomes the apt choice for a steel company taking him or her as a strategic officer. Now, that doesn't define the capability of the chief strategic officer, because knowing the background of the industry is not necessarily the key or the top capability that you would look for in a chief strategic officer. The chief strategic officer's thought process is, if I am presenting you with a completely new industry that you have no clue about, how are you going to really help us out? We know about the industry. So just to reiterate what I said earlier, the 15 people sitting across the board probably have got 10 times experience than what you have in that industry. Hence, you are not going to value add anything to them by knowing any nuance of the industry which they do not know. Like for example, in companies that I have worked, be it Siemens or Cummins or any other companies, you have veterans in these organizations who have been working in these organizations for years, and they know the nut and bolt of the product and what the A to Z is. So what are you really going to tell them on the content part? So your value add really comes in the thought process to say that, okay, fine, I understand what you're saying, but is that really relevant to the problem that we're trying to solve? What is it needed for the problem that we are trying to solve, and how do we bring things together? So it is about a thinking process. It is about a clarity and structuring thought process that you bring, which doesn't depend on industry. So that's what I meant by industry agnostic.
Thank you. And we have two questions from Mr. Manish Kulkarni. And his first question is, with sustainability becoming increasingly important to stakeholders, can you share insights into how CSO integrates environmental, social, and governance, that's ESG factors into its overall strategic decision-making process? The second supplementary or second question is, in today's highly competitive landscape, how does a CSO balance long-term strategic goals with short-term operational demands to ensure sustained growth and profitability? Thank you, Manish.
I think very important and relevant question. So let me start by answering the first one, right? To say that how is ESG integrated? Now, ESG as a process, many of the times is integrated into the way of working. Like for example, the way a particular product is getting manufactured probably is already adhering to the ESG principles. So these are things which probably a CSO doesn't need to get into. It's already got incorporated through the manufacturing, through the businesses, and through the technology heads. They have already incorporated a lot of these aspects into their designing process, into their manufacturing process, etc. But the key place where a CSO needs to play a role in ESG is to say that what does all this mean at an organization level? So if I know that my colleagues in manufacturing and technology and everybody are doing ESG, if I have to communicate or I have to help my CEO communicate this information to the world to say that this is where we land on ESG, how am I going to really do that? So as a CSO, my entire focus is first to say that what is it that we are doing in ESG? So what does ESG mean? Which of course you have a lot of data and information to give you that definition. but more importantly, what are we doing and where are we in the ESG maturity? So are we in stage one, stage two, stage three? Where are we really placed? And being able to then pull together to say that, okay, now if this is what we are doing, how do I really communicate this? How do I really translate this into a communication to the external world to say that this is what we are doing, this is what we want to get into, this is where we want to go, and this is how we're planning to go. So many of the aspects of what the chief strategic officer does is to bring this whole picture together. And of course, in places where this may not be existing, the chief strategic officer needs to wear an additional hat of really starting off this project itself to say that let us define ESG for our organization. But in most cases where it is already present, it's about pulling this together. This is the first part. Your second question around the long term versus short term. This is a huge challenge for most organizations. And this is always a tussle that keeps going along. And many of the times, what happens is the chief strategic officer also might get into the pressure and really get into the short-term planning and short-term discussions. But as a chief strategic officer, the key thing that the chief strategic officer needs to bring on discussion, that's why I said the holding of the chief strategic planning process is an important thing, because that is one process in the organization that really thinks 5 years down the line. It is not a process that speaks about your next year budget or your next year targets. It is a process that says, let us look at 5 years and 6 years down the line, what is your business trying to do? Now, that strategic planning process is a must for the organization. And that is literally the baby of the chief strategic officer. He has to drive it dedicatedly, because it may not necessarily, in some cases, it may not have enough traction from the rest of the organization or rest of the leaders. They may really not give value to that. But it is the chief strategic officer's duty. How That is why I also mentioned about being trusted advisors, being able to build those personal relationships, because the chief strategic officer has to figure out a way how to get this whole team to buy in into a long-term vision rather than getting focused just on my next year growth and next year profitability. So the CSO needs to play that balancing role, because the immediate target is everybody's priority. Everybody will be doing that. So the chief strategic officer needs to pull the people out and say, guys, now let's just step back and see what are we trying to do for the 4 years. So that is one of the critical roles, and a very challenging one though, but it is an important thing that the CSO needs to do.
Thank you, Subramanian. And we have two questions from Mr. Durga Prasad. His first question is, can you please let me know what are the changes Indian companies are trying to adopt post-COVID? Do you feel that the strategies of companies have become stereotyped to achieve success? That's the first part of it. And the second one is, can you please let us know, normally a strategy drawing in terms of mission, vision, strategy is easier for a startup or for an existing company upscaling its operations? Thank you, Durga Prasad.
Thanks a lot for those questions, Mr. Durga Prasad. So the first one, yes, post-COVID, a lot of things. So first thing is, even the working principles or working environment itself has changed, right? And we know that many companies, it's about remote working, working from home, the new normal considerations of working, to say that how many people are back into office. This is the first change that you see. Now, beyond that, the whole question is about the increased use of tools, virtual tools, various other forums for us to do business or interact with each other or to carry on engagements. Now, these aspects do affect the strategy, because when you are going to look at the talent that's going to come into the organization, so when you're looking at a talent strategy, now it's important for us to say that, do we still look at the talent strategy from the way we were looking at earlier, to say that I want the person to be positioned here, to be stationed at this place and do these things? Or are we now looking at a talent strategy which says that, okay, remote working is possible, but with XYZ kind of thing, you're able to attract a different kind of talent from a different set of geography altogether, because these kind of workings make that kind of possibilities available. So the strategies of companies definitely have changed, but that also varies upon the type of company that you are. If you are a completely manufacturing company that has got a huge factory, it would be rather a bit naive for us to say that, okay, you can work from home and the factory will run. The products will come out of the factory. That is not possible for us to do. But if you are doing a company that has got more of desk job or doing jobs on the laptops and desktops, maybe that kind of possibilities exist more. So that's on the first one. Second one is the mission vision strategy. So the mission vision strategy, beyond thinking about it as a startup and upscaling or a established organization. See, as I said, the mission is about why that particular organization came into being. Now, for a startup or for an upscaling company, it's very important because that is the thread by which you're keeping the people together. You're keeping the people together because of what? Yes, you are giving them stock options, you're giving them all those exciting jobs. But beyond that, there is a common purpose or a common objective that all of you are going towards. And that is what really defines the purpose of why this group is there together. That is the mission of that group or that team or that particular startup. So mission in that kind of an environment or at that stage of an organization provides you the motivation and the energy to really say, fine, we want to go ahead. Because for a startup and a upscaling company, things may not be rosy all the time. Things could really go up and down. So how do you really keep up the motivation levels even when the people, it's completely down in the dumps? How do people still remain motivated? The mission becomes very clear, very important. For an established organization, the mission is very important to say, are we staying true to our mission? Because the moment you are beyond a particular level, many of the times you even lose focus. If you conduct a survey of the employees and say, do you know the vision of our company? Maybe half the people don't even know what the vision of the organization is. So that then we are going into a blind spot to say that we really don't know where are we heading towards as a huge, gigantic, mass that is moving, but it is not knowing where it's heading towards. So there it becomes very important to say that are we staying true to our mission? Are we doing things in line with our mission, or does it need a reset? Does it need a rethink? So mission also becomes important for an established organization as well.
Thank you. And next question is from Mr. Gaurav Matkar. His question is, what are the critical strategy challenges you anticipate in the manufacturing domain in the next 3 to 4 year horizon? Thank you, Gaurav.
Thank you. Thanks, Gaurav. See, the manufacturing domain, of course, we spoke about digitalization and AI and everything. Now, what I see in the entire spectrum, if I look at it, if I look at the entire global spectrum, right? All the startups, if you see, most of the startups are in the space of app development, services, digitalization, IT, etc. When you look at core manufacturing, you have very little people who are coming into that space and saying, fine, I'm going to develop something entirely, a completely new material or a new product that can get manufactured and that can get into the whole mainstream thing. Why is this happening? Because manufacturing by itself is not a very, it is a strenuous thing. It has got certain expectations. It has got certain requirements. You need a space, you need things to do, you need certain assets, you need certain infrastructure for it to start running. If things don't go right, you could be in the dumps, there could be problems that you could land up in. This is one part of the story, which is about the incoming into the manufacturing. So people who are into the manufacturing, yes, they are doing the tier ones, the tier twos, the tier threes, SMEs, MSMEs, they are flourishing, they are growing, they are, merging, etc. Now, if you look at the larger part of the organization, the bigger organizations, a lot of things are getting outsourced, right? A lot of outsourcing trend is seen from the bigger organizations. So in the direction of optimization, cost optimization, core competency, and many other aspects, many of the things are going out of the shop floors of the bigger organizations. So what's really happening is that you are getting a lot of opportunities from the perspective of trying to become an entrepreneur, trying to create your own niche in the manufacturing space, because a lot of work could be coming your way. But we need more of I would say, a conducive ecosystem and a conducive risk-taking ability for people to really enter into the manufacturing space as startups. People entering into the manufacturing space as newcomers and still make it happen or still win without bothering too much about what am I going to do if I'm going to land up in a huge debt. Now, underlying all this is this entire aspect of digitalization and AI that is taking deep roots into the manufacturing domain, which is to say that a lot of the manufacturing aspects and manufacturing processes are getting digitalized, are getting driven through AI. that is making certain roles redundant, but that is not bad because it is only asking us the question to say that what is really the value add of human capital or labor in manufacturing. Because X amount of job I can already take as the digital app. Then you as a human being, what are you contributing to manufacturing? So it's really questioning our ability or our capability to contribute to manufacturing, which is a good thought process, but we need to understand that thought process and start progressing to say that what more do we do in the manufacturing space. Now, beyond this, there is a huge network of supply chain, which is becoming more and more volatile by the day. So manufacturing as a whole is what I spoke about, but manufacturing is not an isolated game. It functions in an entire ecosystem of suppliers, vendors, uh, supply chain systems, warehouses, transportations, all of which are hugely interconnected, not just within a country, but globally. So any global disturbance easily flows into each of these aspects. So it's very important that the challenges in manufacturing going ahead would be uh, the challenges that digital and AI is going to pose in front of us, the challenges of not enough entrepreneurs or newcomers really coming into this space, uh, the challenges of bigger organizations probably losing their expertise in certain areas which they're outsourcing completely outside of the organization, and the challenges of a volatile ecosystem or a volatile supply chain world that is going to really flow in seamlessly into manufacturing and it's going to create disruptions.
Thank you. I think still have quite a few questions, Chidambaram. And next question is from Padmaja. Her question is, any book you would recommend for strategy building in personal and professional life? Thank you, Padmaja.
So you have a few books, like you have books like Good to Great, uh, the winning strategy, how to win. So I could pass on some of these titles across maybe to Dr. Narendra, and probably you can share it with the
Sure.
participants.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Absolutely.
I think a book is always a good, but I always prefer to say that what is the internalization that we do from every strategic job that we are trying to do on the ground, whether it be in professional or personal life. The more you're internalizing, the more clear your thought process becomes, because the book still gives you, say, a framework, say, talks about a history, talks about a way things were done. But when you do certain things and you realize certain things as you're going on the ground, on the go, on the job, that is what gives you the more clarity to say that, okay, this is what strategy was about. This is not working. This seems to be working the best. So I always rely a lot on individual experience and the insights from them.
Thank you. And this is a question from Mr. Ajay Chabra. His question is, how are digital transformation and strategy building related? Is digital transformation a person has a bigger umbrella now in a volatile, complex business world as compared to chief strategy role? Thank you, Ajay.
Absolutely. I think a digital transformation needs a dedicated person because the capabilities and skill sets of a strategic officer and a digital transformation is completely different. Like you cannot expect the chief strategic officer to just double up as a digital transformation head when he may not even know the ABC of IT or digital or how the whole thing is going to get transformed. So that would be very naive to assume that both the roles are going to be done by a single person. The digital transformation is emerging as a critical trend for most companies, and that needs a definite set of capabilities which are very specific to the digital tools, to the understanding of digital processes, and people who have done these in the past, who have done these kind of transformations in various organizations, they would be the best placed to drive this for the other organizations as well.
And this is Mr. Manish Kulkarni. He has two questions. One is a personal one, other one is related to CSO. How does the CSO prioritize innovation within the strategic framework to maintain a competitive edge in the manufacturing industry? And what are the key initiatives that drive innovation? That's the first one, Subramanian. Second one is a personal question: how to learn Sanskrit language?
Okay. So the first one, prioritizing. I think this is always a difficult task to say that what is to be prioritized, because the prioritization most of the times would end up into areas or into topics that are more short term, that are more visible, that are more tangible, that you know are going to give you definitive results. This would be the places where you would definitely prioritize. So the entire aspect of innovation, which is not necessarily going to yield you a return on investment or a return on your asset in the coming 2 or 3 years, and might be a 5 year or 6 year program, it requires a lot of conviction. It requires the entire organization to be bought in. So the CSO, what the CSO could do is the CSO can present to the best of his or her abilities and convince. The job of the CSO is to convince the required stakeholders that what is needed now is not to deprioritize a very important activity because it is going to yield us benefit in the longer term. So we need to keep pumping in money or keep invested in a particular area because it is in the spirit of innovation and it's in the spirit of our longer term growth rather than shorter term profitability. So this is a hat that the CSO needs to keep bearing. And the CSO should not wear the typical business hat and a CFO hat and say that I'm looking at profitability of the next quarter and the next year. That doesn't become the role of the CSO there. The personal question on how to learn Sanskrit language, of course, there are various options available. You have various institutions like Samskrita Bharati and others who teach Sanskrit through speech, like speaking through Sanskrit, and that's how you learn the language. The other method is to learn the language formally through the grammar and through the principles and academically learn it. Most people say preferably say that the first method is much more easier to learn, but the easiest way to learn Sanskrit is to just read Sanskrit, right? To just keep reading Sanskrit and to, along with the translations, of course, to start with, and then start picking up to say that making up your own connections of reading a line, reading the translation, reading the word by word translation and saying, okay, this is what it means. Let me go next. And reading, and you have so much of literature available today, which is in simple Sanskrit, which could be read. And then through that, you develop a familiarity with those words, familiarity with the construction, familiarity with the language. And that is the way you could proceed with learning the language.
Thank you. And this is a question from Mr. Gopal Krishnan. And his question is, once a team agrees upon a strategy, how long do we stick on to it when we realize the strategy falls short of the targets, considering the fact that many times the deliverables may be taking longer than envisaged? Thank you, Gopal.
I think that's a fantastic question. That is why whenever we define, I mentioned about measuring the strategy. It's important to define KPIs, but to your point, many of these things would yield result only 3 years or 4 years down the line. So what KPIs are you really going to put for that? So it's very important that you still need to define KPIs to say that if suppose I'm starting a project today, that's going to give me revenue 4 years down the line. So my KPI today cannot be revenue because the revenue is anyway not going to come for 3 years. So what is my KPI going to be? My KPIs should be those that give me more and more confidence to say that this project is going in the right direction. It could be multiple things. It could be to say that if the project is about developing a particular product for an end customer, the first point could be, has my design of the product got completed? Is that stage completed? Has the product really got certified? Have I done any pilots or any demos of that product? Have I received any sort of complaints, any sort of feedback on these products? Have I had any sort of inputs coming in from the customers about my products? Have I placed my products in various seminars, conferences, and expos, and what is the feedback I'm getting? So these are all multiple ways which may not be tangible numbers, but these are the feelings or the feelers that you get to say that, am I confident that this is going in the right direction, or am I not getting a feeling that this is going in the right direction? So we must still define KPIs. The mistake that many people do is that when they know that this is a longer term project, they don't define KPIs. They define KPIs 4 years down the line. How in the world are you going to know that the 4 years the project is going to run on track? So we need to have those project KPIs need to be on table.
Thank you, Subramanian. This is a call. Now we have 3 more questions, and with your permission.
Sure.
And third last one is from Pooja Nanda. Her question is, what are the key tips to define a thought process within bracket strategy for a business growth when you are a beginner in crafting a strategy? Thank you, Pooja.
So the key thing that we need to always remember is that first thing, you're doing a strategy. Whoever is doing the strategy, in most cases, it is not rocket science that you're trying to do, right? The solution is there in the organization itself. As a strategist, you are playing the role of a problem solver. You are just trying to solve a problem. The question is, how accurately are you defining the problem? That's the first part of the solution. The first part of the solution is, how rightly and accurately are you defining the problem? And the second part is, how are you really eliciting the solution for that problem from the organization itself. So when you're saying crafting a strategy, that is what we need to keep in mind all the time, to say that, am I defining the problem rightly? Is this the problem? Constantly keep asking the question, is this the problem really that I'm trying to solve, or is the problem something else? And one thing that a strategist must always not hesitate is to ask questions. Questioning is the tool that the strategic or the strategist or the strategic officer needs to always employ. Keep asking questions that drive you towards the insight. So the key tip I would say is keep questioning and keep rethinking on the fact that, is this the right problem that you're trying to solve? And then I think half the problem is already solved, and then you get into the solution.
The second last question, Subramanian, is from Sanket Mahajan. His question is, this is with reference to your comment on spending only a certain amount of time or period of time in strategy execution and implementation. After being there for 5 to 6 years in the strategy domain, can a tenure in an EA with a holistic business view of different business verticals be treated as a contribution in the strategy execution stroke implementation part, as he or she is not part of the strategy team directly? How do you suggest such an individual to carry forward in their career? Would you suggest getting back to the strategy domain that may make a natural sense, or into business vertical as a leader, or in a certain key position of the business? Thank you, Sanket.
Yeah,
I don't know if he has gone through it or if
yeah,
he's going through it right now.
yes, he's probably he's going through the beats. Uh, so this, of course, it may be difficult to give a generic answer, but when I say that the person has to be involved in strategic execution and implementation, what I mean to say is that the issue of not getting involved at all in strategy execution or implementation is that you really do not know, you are really a bit away from the reality of what you're trying to formalize. So if you are making a strategy, you do not consider those aspects that could typically go wrong in implementing the strategy, because that will only come to you when you have really burnt your fingers, or you have really known what really happens on the ground when such a strategy goes into implementation phase. So that is why I always feel that it is important for, and in many of the companies, you do have those roles as special projects or transformation leaders, because many of the projects, they get incubated within a group, because these are not still in a maturity stage to move into the business. So they keep getting incubated in the strategy or in similar such groups. Those are the right places where the strategy officer or the strategy team members really need to wear the execution hat and really say, how do I make this happen? So if I am, for example, developing a strategy for a battery energy storage system, I also need to get into the mode of bidding for a battery energy storage system. I need to write a proposal, an RFQ. I need to respond to a tender. I need to maybe win a particular tender. I need to see how this tender gets into execution. That is when I know what does a typical battery energy storage system requirement is, and what does the government customer need, what does the private customer need. That is going to impact my strategy, because that is how I'm going to then define the product. Now, with specific thing on EA versus others, I am not very sure whether such roles, it again depends on how these roles are crafted, right? Because the name could be an EA or XYZ, but what that role does in reality is what we need to look at. So is the EA still executing projects and implementing projects? Then probably it's a much stronger role. But if the EA is just acting as an EA without doing much of implementation, then it is as good or bad as being in the strategy team. So that needs to be thought from case to case to say that what is the role really offering you as an opportunity.
This is a question from Mr. Vijay Vishwanath. His question is, thank you very much for your insights. What is the best way to tackle strategic uncertainties, or any goals or objectives that organization is having trouble in achieving? Thank you, Vijay.
So first thing is, so when a strategy plan is not working, a strategic initiative is not working, or a particular objective of the organization is not getting achieved, the first thing is to accept it, to say that, yes, my strategy has failed, or there is a problem in my strategy. Many of the times people find it difficult to even accept that, right? To even distance themselves from the strategy and say, okay, I could have committed a mistake and put a wrong strategy in place. So that's the first point. Second point is, only when you do that, when you accept that that could be a flaw in my strategy or in the way we have executed or the way we have thought about it, would you then think about the solution part to say what did really go wrong in that strategy or in that particular initiative? Then is where you try to do an unbiased investigation into what went wrong or what really happened. And that is when you start to uncover problems or issues that you have really encountered there. So the best way to tackle strategic uncertainties, so two ways. So one is if you have already done a strategic initiative, it has gone wrong or it's not happening, you need to really step back, accept the problem and get into the solutioning mode. Second is that if due to XYZ reasons your strategy doesn't seem to work, that is why it's always important that even if a strategy gets made and you do not keep revising your strategy every year or every 6 months, because that is not the objective of strategy. But you need to have certain signposts and certain milestones defined in your strategy. So you can say that this is my strategy, but I need to have a lookout for the natural gas prices, for the diesel prices, and the petrol prices. The moment these slide down beyond a point, that means there is a problem that we have in our strategy. So when you have such signposts, you would be constantly monitoring these KPIs or these metrics. And the moment they go beyond a threshold, you would then revisit your strategy to say, does my strategy still hold good? Because these parameters have got disturbed. Or if there is a major disruption that has happened in the market, you need to be eyes and ears open to say that, okay, if this has happened, what does this mean for my strategy? So it basically says that once you have made a strategy, you cannot close it, keep it in a shelf and say that my strategy is done. That is not how strategy works. You need to constantly keep on the lookout to say what are the different things that could affect my strategy to the best of your abilities, of course. We are not going to be gods and say that we know everything. But whatever we know, we should be able to feed in. That is why you must have. That's why also I feel that the strategic officer and the strategic team must talk to different strata within the organization. They need to talk to the leaders. They need to talk to the L1s and L2s. They need to talk to people working on the shop floor. They need to talk to the sales officers who are on the floor, on the ground, talking to customers. They need to talk with suppliers. They need to have this connect, 360-degree connect, to pick up signals, to say if there is anything going wrong, you will at least get those signals from anywhere. So you need to pick up those signals and you need to start thinking, okay, if this is what is happening, then something is going wrong. So let me start having a proper discussion and see how my strategy is going to get affected. So I think in this entire thing of tackling strategic uncertainties and not achieving the goals, I would say these are some of the things that we could do.
Thank you so much, Subramanian. I think we have already overshot by 20 minutes. And thank you so much for a very engaging Q&A session. I think it's a phenomenal thing. And I think I'm sure, like I've written there, I think it really helped to unlayer or, this the entire edifice of chief strategic officer or strategy officer. And I'm sure each one of them must be going out of this session with a clear an idea. Maybe some of this can be implemented their own way at a business level, strategy level. It need not be that they have got to be a chief strategy officer. I think all of this, the techniques or let's say that the entire thought process can be adopted at their own business strategy level, which can actually help them to be a good chief strategy officer as and when they want to be or they grow to be. Thank you so much, Subramanian, and we couldn't take all of the questions. I think we have left, because of overshooting of time. But thank you so much once again from all of us, and especially on a Saturday evening. I look forward to hosting you once again for another interesting topic, Subramanian. Very, very insightful. Very insightful.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Nagendra, for this wonderful opportunity and getting to interact with all of them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank all of you. Thanks.